The health benefits of removing toxic people from your life may have far greater benefits to both physical and psychological health than any other lifestyle changes. Narcissistic people are constantly stimulating stress chemicals in you. Narcissism, entitlement, and incivility have become the new world order, and we are all in trouble. There's nothing better that you can do for your health than remove toxic people from your life.
Welcome to the Rejuvenate Podcast. I'm your host, Krissy Hawks, and I'm here with my co-host, Elwin Robinson. And today we are talking about narcissism and relationships. So, Elwin, tell me, why this topic? Why today?
Well, I've been meaning to talk about this for a long time because I feel like understanding what I'm going to share in this episode was a key to myself recovering my health. Actually, both times, both around the time I turned 30 and the time I turned 40. Discovering this and doing something about it made a huge impact for me. So one of the people who I've learned about this from is called Dr Ramani. She has a channel on YouTube that has a massive amount of content on this topic. She's not the only one I've learned from. I've read about half a dozen books on the subject. I've spoken to numerous therapists about the subject, but I'll probably refer to her several times in the episode. She's a good resource. So anyway, she wrote in the introduction to her book, health and wellness campaigns preach avoidance of unhealthy foods, sedentary lifestyles, tobacco, drugs, and alcohol, but rarely preach avoidance of unhealthy, difficult, or toxic people. Yet the health benefits of removing toxic people from your life may have far greater benefits to both physical and psychological health than any other lifestyle changes. We need to learn to be better gatekeepers for our minds, bodies, and souls. Narcissism, entitlement, and incivility have become the new world order, and we are all in trouble. They are not only normalized, but also increasingly incentivized. They are manifestations of pathological insecurities that are experienced at both the individual and societal level. The paradox is that we value these patterns. We venerate them through social media, mainstream media, and consumerism, and they are endemic in political, corporate, academic, and media leaders. There are few lives untouched by narcissists. These relationships infect those who are in them with self-doubt, despair, confusion, anxiety, depression, and the chronic feeling of not being enough or not good enough, all of which makes it very difficult to step away and set boundaries. The illusion of hope and the fantasy of improvement in the situation can result in years of second chances and feeling despondent when change never comes. It's time for a wake-up call. It's time to stem the tide of narcissism, entitlement, and antagonism and take our lives back. So I know that's a lot to read out, but I think it's a really good introduction because it points out a few key points, which are why I want to do the episode. First of all, arguably, and I actually tend to agree with her about this, there's nothing better that you can do for your health than remove toxic people from your life and resolve toxic relationship dynamics. So sometimes you get two people, both of whom mean well, but the dynamic between them is toxic. We're going to focus less on that in this episode, but I'd like to do that in a future episode. This one is more about really being able to actually recognize toxic people and what to do with them. In the same way that previous episodes have been about recognizing toxic substances, recognizing toxic supplements, recognizing toxic foods, whatever, recognizing toxic skincare products, In this one, we're talking about the people in our lives. So that's number one. Number two is that this narcissism thing is an epidemic, that it's becoming, I would say it's the real pandemic. It's something that is becoming more prevalent in our whole world, not even only our Western society, in the whole world now more than it ever has before in recorded history. And the third thing is that a lot of narcissism is actually seen as desirable. So if there were this pandemic of toxicity and evil, but we all knew that's what it was, then it would be more like Star Wars, right? The good side versus the dark side or whatever. Or, Lord of the Rings, right? Simple mentality. There's the evil Sauron and the good whatever. But this is not like that. This is actually where we've been convinced that a lot of the traits and behavior and attitudes of narcissists are a good thing, things that we should be working towards. We should be more like that. We should be more like them. So it's a particularly difficult thing to manage, and we might feel insecure, not good enough, worthless, all these things, because we're not more narcissistic. That's the crazy thing.
Right.
So it's a very, very difficult subject, I would say, which is why we haven't done it until now. But I'd say it's crucially important. So if you're watching this, please don't think that this doesn't apply to you, because even if you have managed to keep every narcissistic person out of your personal life, if so, congratulations. But even then, with media and the way it is these days, almost everyone that is on media, and this is probably true 100 years ago to a large degree, even though if not as much as now, like big movie stars in the past, probably usually were big politicians, big whatever, people who people might watch or listen to, creative types who are highly successful often have narcissistic traits for reasons we'll go into. So even if you don't have any in your personal life, you probably still are listening to them and watching them every day without realizing, and they're still affecting you.
You're exposed no matter what. They'll be around you. Before we get into my questions, you mentioned that you said it was a key aspect of you getting better. So I wanted to ask you about that. If you could share a little bit more, if that's going to give a little bit too much away for later. But that point really stuck out, how that really helped affect your health in such a dramatic way.
I think, that will become clearer as the episode goes on. But what I would say is narcissistic people are constantly stimulating stress chemicals in you. This can be the reason why we would put up with that or even seek it out, is because it can be interpreted as exciting, right? And in fact, if you are habituated to being around narcissistic people, especially if you have been since you were born, then not having people constantly involving you in drama and stimulating stress in you can feel boring, can feel unexciting. And so getting off that roller coaster of excitement or really stress is essential for healing. We've talked about that in other episodes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or when you have chronic high stress. And if you are around these kind of toxic people, it will be amazing if you don't have chronic high stress.
Good point. Right. So let's delve in. So what are the traits of a narcissist?
So this is an interesting one. When I was in my 20s, I read like a lot of books about spirituality, and a lot of them were, good in some ways, but a lot of fluff. One of the ones I came across was a guy called Carlos Castaneda, who claimed to work with a shaman from the Mexico region, who taught him all kinds of stuff about, I guess what we might call enlightenment. And he said that the two things stopping you from being enlightened are self-importance and self-pity. So those are like the two traps that you, as a person who wants to be a better person, needs to avoid in yourself at all times. So, that's the framework I came from. The kind of classic psychology framework is expanded a little bit these days. It used to be called a dark triad, and now it's called a dark tetrad, the updated version. And so they talk about 4 different traits of evil, might be a word for it, badness. This is a tricky one because, part of what's happened in our culture is we have come to believe that morality is subjective, right? That, and I think this is partly just because of exposure to different cultures. So we're like, oh, well, this culture, they think a completely different thing is good and bad. And this culture, they think,
correct.
So it makes it hard to believe in morality as an absolute. But things in violation of conscience, I guess that would be a way of putting it. Most people, but not all people, have a conscience. This is a tricky thing because most people with a conscience assume that everyone else has one. And so they assume that everyone else means well and that they're trying, that they're doing their best. And they don't accept that some people have a purely predatory mindset or a purely parasitic mindset, don't give a damn about you, have no empathy, no whatever. And so yeah, that can be tricky. So the 4 dark tetrad traits, let me talk about this. So there's Machiavellianism, which is, a complicated word, but the key quality is manipulativeness. So they never just do things spontaneously or authentically. Everything is done for a reason, to get something. So that's Machiavellianism. Often they are ambitious and power hungry. Sociopathy is the next one. So this has a lot to it. This is not the full-blown diagnosis of psychopathy. This is more like the trait of sociopathy. And the thing that really makes it stand out from the other 4 dark tetrad traits, it actually is impulsiveness. So they're the type of the 4 tetrads that are most likely to end up in jail because they just do things without thinking about the consequences.
Right. Okay.
There's narcissism. And so that's the one we're going to go through in detail. And then the last one is sadism. So that is the enjoyment of the suffering of others, which most people would say, oh, well, that's not me. But think about like the person who you think is the worst person in the world, or people, group of people. And then imagine that you saw in the news that something horrible had happened to them. That little smile that you've got even now, Krissy, is like, so we all have a little bit of it. And all of these things from a scientific evolutionary point of view, because I used almost religious terminology a minute ago, they have survival and reproduction potential benefits. I've seen kind of like game theories about this, that if you take a population and you have no predatory percentage of people in there, that people get very complacent, and like the rate that the population like degenerates is quite quick. If you have a very small amount of a predatory element in there, it keeps everyone on their toes, it keeps everyone evolving, it keeps everyone learning and growing, and there's like a reason to not be complacent, to not stagnate. But of course, if there's too much of the predatory influence in there, and especially if that predatory influence ends up in charge of the rest of the population, then the whole population can also be destroyed. And we could argue that's happened many times throughout recorded history of different civilizations that have become big and strong and then collapsed again. So those are the 4 kind of dark tetrad traits, the closest that modern psychology, which is not based on religion, that's based in science, but it considers to be evil, right? And narcissism is one of those. So, okay, what are the narcissistic traits specifically? So I would say the most crucial thing to understand is that they're fundamentally driven by the need for attention above all else. And this separates them from the classic psychopath, because the psychopath, all psychopaths are also narcissistic. Not all narcissists are psychopathic. The psychopath is fundamentally interested in power, whereas the narcissist is fundamentally interested in attention. So there are different types of narcissists that we'll go through. Some narcissists may be quite satisfied, with attention, even if it's very negative attention, for instance, or even if it leaves them in a very, low social status position or a low power position, whereas, the psychopath seeks the feeling of power. And depending on how sophisticated they are, if they're unsophisticated, that may be engaged in criminal acts of, murder and torture and stuff like that. Whereas if it's a sophisticated person, they may become a political leader or a business leader or maybe even a medical leader, where they can inflict a lot of harm without, while being able to get away with it. So, but the narcissist is fundamentally driven by attention. That's the most important thing. And so that's a lot of the time when they act in a certain way and you're like, why are you acting that way? It's because to them, they'd rather get the type of attention they prefer, but ultimately always some attention is better than no attention, even if it's bad. They tend to be charming. They tend to be charismatic, to some degree at least. They tend to be intense. They tend to be exciting. We talked about that a little bit already. And they often seem strong and confident, unless you really understand what's going on. But they often make very big, bold, grandiose statements. We'll talk about grandiosity in a minute. And they often speak with a lot of certainty. And so in a world where a lot of people are feeling very insecure, and unsure of themselves, again, because of all the changes that have gone on in the last 100 years. Like we're open to so many more different perspectives than we ever used to be, that it's very difficult to still feel confident for a naturally healthy, authentic person. And so it's very compelling when someone seems to have a very high amount of confidence and certainty in themselves. So those are the strong qualities and the reason why we tend to be drawn to them. But let's go through the problems.
Okay, yeah.
So grandiosity is one thing. So there's a difference between grandiosity and grandeur. So grandeur could be like celebrating the areas where you are truly great at something. Grandiosity means that it's exaggeration always. Right? So it's thinking that you're more important than you are, thinking that you're more special than you are, thinking that you're stronger, smarter, more beautiful, whatever it might be, right? That feeling that you are
a little bit
more
above
than
everybody else, something like that.
Always above everyone else.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Feeling like you're more important than everyone else probably is the fundamental thing. Everything else is secondary. Absolutely, yeah. They tend to have a lack of self-awareness. Self-awareness being crucial because unlike a lot of other types of psychiatric diagnoses, they often have quite a good level of awareness of other people. It's only their self-awareness that is so severely lacking. Whereas with a lot of other mental health issues, there's often a huge lack of awareness of other people as well. But with them, it's self-awareness specifically. This is down to a big disparity. So everyone has an idealized self-image, sometimes referred to as a superego. Most people are kind of prompted and ideally inspired and unfortunately often plagued by their idealized self-image. So inspired maybe like, I can live up to this, but often plagued like, oh God, I'm so useless, I'm so bad because I'm not living up to this, right? This is what a lot of us are experiencing. Now, the narcissist comes from a different place. They, for whatever reason that we'll get into, have to feel like they are already their ideal self-image. And that is why they are often very hypersensitive to any criticism or any negative feedback. They don't always display it, but they often do, because it challenges their attempt to stay identified with their self-image. Their idealized self-image. So that's why there's a lack of self-awareness, because they see themselves as their ideal self, not their actual self. A lack of personal responsibility is really crucial. They will tend to always be the victim. Any situation where things go wrong, which they'll get themselves into very frequently, it is never their fault. An inability to admit that they've made a mistake, an inability to apologize. If they ever do those things, you'll tend to find it'll be in one of two ways. Either they'll do it while making themselves a victim. So they might be like, oh, I always get everything wrong. I can never do anything good enough. And that is not sincere. And it's an attempt to get attention and, sympathy, praise, all the rest of it. The other way that they might do it, if they're really backed into a corner psychologically and they feel like they have to take responsibility or apologize, they might do it. Often it will be reticent and sullen. And then later they will take it back. So any apology or taking blame is temporary, as well as performative. But often they just won't do it at all. You'll very frequently meet a narcissist who's never apologized for doing something wrong in their life. Not about anything meaningful anyway. And in fact, it's one of the tools I recommend to judge people if they're truly narcissistic personality disorder or just a mild narcissism. We'll talk about the difference between those. Let's just talk about the traits. So other people are just tools to narcissists. They're not real, or they're not as real, depending on what's going on for them. And so this is like everyone is born narcissistic. So every child, every baby is narcissistic. They kind of believe that the whole universe revolves around them, that they're the only ones that are real. And then at some point they kind of learn this distinction that other people are also real, usually with the mother first, right? Oh, my mother's in pain. Oh, it's not just me who has pain, and whatever. But the narcissists don't really go through that. They don't properly go through it, or they don't go through it at all. There's some debate about this because it's very hard, of course, to know what another person is truly feeling or truly experiencing. But from everything we've seen, if they have empathy, it's so locked away, it may as well not be there. And I think it is there. I think that's one of the distinctions. Whereas a psychopathic person truly doesn't have empathy. I believe the narcissist is capable of it and has it somewhere deep down inside, but it's rarely a priority compared to all the other stuff that we talked about. They cannot manage their feelings of not getting their own way. So this often frustration, disappointment. Very frequently they will lash out, or they will massively implode, or they will act out with addiction, or maybe they will go heavy into addictions. But there's very little of that. Oh well, sometimes things don't go my way, that's okay. That's life. There is, of course, an intense arrogance, right? So thinking that you're more important, thinking that you know better, tendency for judgment and criticism of other people, and feeling superior. I guess that's the fundamental element of arrogance. Delusional mindset, we've really talked about that. I would say, this is my observation, I don't think I've seen it from any other expert, that they have a predatory and or parasitic mindset. So the more... Can you
really define, I think you were just about to, but can you make those distinctions?
Yeah, so the more dominant types they all want your attention, but the more dominant types will treat you as a tool to get what they want, which is attention and praise and validation and stuff like that. The less dominant types will more tend to manipulate rather than dominate to get what they want. And that might be pity, sympathy, support, those kind of elements of attention. But in either case, they are using you as a tool to get a resource that they feel they need. Hence, I'd call that predatory or parasitic, depending on the strategy used to get it. They're very superficial. They often, don't necessarily talk superficial, but you'll see it in, an excessive focus on people's appearance, focus on their money, focus on their status, focus on their social, currency, whatever, right? So they may often talk about grandiose ideas of, equality and fraternity and stuff like that. But when it actually comes to it, you'll see they often judge people and themselves as well in a very, very superficial way. So sophistry means not caring about a truth when you're making an argument. So
never let the truth get in the way of a good story, as some people say.
Yeah. And, they'll be happy to fight for, opposing positions. And if it's pointed out to a normal person, they might feel some degree of shame or, whoops, right? I've contradicted myself, or I'm being a hypocrite. It's irrelevant to them if it's pointed out that they're being hypocritical. They don't care, not really. Although they may make a show of caring, but that's all just part of the show. They'll do it again. They don't really care. Solipsism basically means, and this is more the extreme end of narcissism, but the only person that's real is me. So this gets down to disassociation as well, but feeling like, so even beyond, other human beings are real, but they're my tools, is like they're not even real. And you see this things like The Matrix, things like The Truman Show, these kind of movies, these kind of ideas that everyone else is just like a character or, like an NPC. They're not a real person like I'm a real person. And so that's very common, and it explains a lot of their behavior, right? If you're not real and yet you have this resource that they need, then of course anything's justified in terms of what they do to you. Entitlement is huge. One of the main things that's often talked about. What does entitlement mean? It means like they feel like they deserve to get things, usually whatever they want, without having earned it. That's the crucial distinction to me. And so a lot of what I've just said, it all resolves around one thing. And I don't see too many people talk about this, but one book I read goes into it in detail. And I think it's a really good point. A lot of this all revolves around shamelessness. They don't have a feeling of shame. Because if you think about it, if you started acting like you deserve whatever you want, even without earning it, you wouldn't, because you'd feel too ashamed or embarrassed to do it. You know, if you started contradicting yourself and being a complete hypocrite and someone pointed it out, you'd be ashamed, right? You'd be embarrassed. Oh God, right. You know, and all of it, even, you know, the superficial behavior, the parasitic behavior, the delusional behavior, you know, because of course, if you go around delusional, people will point out, you know, you're not perfect, you're not whatever. And then, you know, a normal reaction would be, oh, to be ashamed or embarrassed about acting like you're perfect when you're not. So a lot of the behavior, I would say, can be explained by a complete pathological resistance to feeling shame. And the interesting thing about shamelessness is when a person acts shamelessly, they make everyone else around them feel shame.
Feel shame. Yeah. Good point. Yeah. And then when you feel shame, you back down. Yeah, you know, so it's like, oh, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, when people act so shamelessly, it absolutely makes you feel shame, and then you're more likely to be compliant, which is exactly the point, which is exactly what they want. So shame is a really key one. If you feel shame around a person and you notice they don't, I would say, even though it's not a common diagnostic tool, that is one of the best possible indicators. Now, psychopathic people also don't feel shame. But remember what I said earlier, all psychopathic people are also narcissists. Psychopathic people also don't feel guilt and they don't feel fear. Narcissistic people, I would say, they are capable of guilt, even though they're not capable of admitting they're wrong. And they're definitely capable of fear. So it's not, you know, as extreme. I'm not sure if narcissistic people are not capable of feeling shame, or if they pathologically suppress it or repress it, so they're never aware of it. I don't know. I have not seen research in that area, but they act as if they don't have it, whether they really do have it or not. And it doesn't seem to be that you can teach it to them. Now, it's interesting to talk about these things like shame and guilt. And, you know, these kind of people are often attracted to spiritual systems, you know, New Age spirituality these days, because New Age spirituality teaches that guilt and shame are terrible feelings and you should avoid them. And also a lot of modern day psychology, like the psychology of the 60s of personal self-esteem, right? Boosting self-esteem. There was kind of a whole school of raising children in a way that, you know, never promoted shame in them, because shame is such a terrible thing. But if you say that someone is shameless or society is shameless, it's not a compliment. You know, for a reason, because, you know, negative, painful feelings, again, I don't call them negative feelings like the New Age world does. I call them painful feelings because they're not negative. They serve a purpose. If you find if you find someone shameless, that's not good. If you find someone who doesn't feel guilt, that's not good. If you find someone who doesn't feel fear, that's not good. You know, someone who doesn't feel guilt will just hurt people and doesn't care. Someone who doesn't feel fear will be extremely reckless and do, you know, all kinds of things that endanger themselves and others. So these feelings are really, really important, and we see that with shame. But of course, a society that's being run by narcissists will act like shame is a bad thing and should not be allowed. Now, just as a point of contrast, what would a non-narcissist look like, right? What kind of qualities would they have?
Narcissist, not narcissist.
And so humility would be a huge one. Modesty, patience, openness to being wrong, openness to learning new things, compassion, temperance, which is an old-fashioned word that basically means not overdoing it, forgiveness, personal responsibility, and authenticity. So people who display large amounts of these qualities on a regular basis are not narcissistic. I also think it's interesting to note that, a lot of the qualities that I just gave are quite strongly Christian qualities. And I'm not, Christian myself, although I was raised that way. I used to have quite negative feelings of Christianity because of my upbringing. But I have to say, having learned about narcissism has actually given me a lot more sympathy for where Christianity was and is a valid and helpful religion, belief system, because it really does promote anti-narcissistic qualities more than most. Now, I'd say another religion that also does is Buddhism in its own different way. And although a lot of those qualities I just said are, strong for Buddhism, and I'm sure there's other religions as well. I'm just naming, some of the very biggest ones. And so some people say that the reason why the whole world is kind of descending into a lot of narcissism is because the religions have been taken away. And I think there may be a grain of truth to that. But it's not purely Christianity. So do you know, Krissy, what was considered to be the biggest sin throughout most ancient religions?
No, I don't.
It was actually pride or hubris.
Right.
So thinking that you were not just better than other people, but, specifically with these old religions, it was that you were as high as a god or even better than the gods. That was the ultimate sin. And so, what does God represent? Something larger than us, right? Maybe the creator of the universe, the overseer of the universe, whatever, But thinking that you are as important as that is exactly what a narcissist does. As I said, solipsism is part of it. And narcissists are often drawn to, religions and belief systems that emphasize personal empowerment, which is a good thing. But to the idea of the whole, I can make the universe the way I am with the power of manifestation and all that kind of stuff. Again, I don't believe is wrong, but I see it's very attractive to narcissists and attracts a lot of narcissists because it's this idea that I can be God and I can rule the world. That's the ultimate ambition of a narcissist. And the difference is, the psychopath is more focused on ruling. The narcissist is more focused on everyone worshipping them. But but both would be very happy to be in a godlike position. And wanting to be in a godlike position is the biggest sin in, as I say, most ancient religions, whether we're talking about, ancient Greek, ancient Roman, ancient Egyptian, the Judaism, Christianity, the Eastern ones, Buddhism, whatever, there's loads of them that all said that this pride or hubris is the greatest sin. If we look at the Christian one for a moment, what was the thing that, created Lucifer, right? Lucifer was originally God's greatest angel, and it was through the sin of pride that he fell and became Satan, the devil, and all the rest of it, the chief of all evil. And so I do think, and that's why I mentioned the dark tetrad thing right at the beginning as well, I do think that narcissism is something that either is evil or certainly leads to evil. And so what does that mean? I think one of the ways of looking at that is good is often characterized by beauty and order and harmony. And then bad is often characterized by ugliness and chaos and discord and disharmony. And so I think that narcissism leads to those things. And that is why it's so destructive, to go back to your first question. And can we live in a non-narcissistic world? Not right now, although we might do our best to help create one. But, living in the world that is full of that and not letting it ruin you and not letting it infect you so that you also become that way is a very difficult challenge, but a very important one.
So you did a wonderful job of explaining, the traits of a narcissist. Now, and then, what somebody who isn't a narcissist, what their traits are. And then in my head, I'm like, well, some of the things that you were saying earlier about where the person is well, that's it, I always get everything wrong. I've heard that from many people. Now, how can I tell if that person is a narcissist?
That's a great question. Okay, so just like there's depression and clinical depression, there is possessing narcissistic traits, which most of us do. and then there is full-blown narcissistic personality disorder. So narcissistic personality disorder is a category B personality disorder. It goes also with borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder and a couple of others I don't remember, but those are the main ones. And so a category B is like the ones that are most difficult to be around.
Okay, is that what that distinction is? Okay.
It's not the official written down in DSM kind of distinction, but it's the one that psychiatrists all kind of recognize. They're the ones that, and here's the key thing. They're difficult to be around, but certainly in the case of the narcissistic and the antisocial, they feel like there's nothing wrong with them and it's everyone else that's the problem. And borderlines feel that way at least some of the time or a lot of the time. So because of that, they rarely submit themselves for mental health help, let alone evaluation. And so because of that, there is a lot of guessing as to what the prevalence is. I've seen from official sources anything from 0.5% of people who have full-blown narcissistic personality disorder to as much as 10%. And I think Dr. Ramani, I've even heard talking about more, like 30% sometimes or something like that. But I'm not 100% sure she's talking about personality disorder in that case or just people who have strong narcissistic traits. But they are on a spectrum. So these days we talk about the autism spectrum, right? So there is a narcissistic spectrum. There's people on one end who do a little bit occasionally of what I said. And then there's people on the other hand who literally can't do anything else. So the person with narcissistic personality disorder will never, in my experience, genuinely feel feelings of remorse and say them without a huge lot of caveats. I mean, I've seen it with caveats. So they'll spend 2 minutes saying sorry for what they did and 58 minutes talking about how terrible their life was and how much worse it was.
And this is the reason why and everything else of what, yeah.
So, but just a sincere, authentic, I'm sorry, without a huge amount of excuse and justification and making it seem like they have it so much worse than you and all the rest of it. They won't ever do that. So personal responsibility is one. Shamelessness is a big one. So most people, for instance, will not want to. Well, most normal people, which I guess are less and less common, but they won't want to make other people feel sorry for them because it's shameful. So it's like 100 years ago, the idea of saying things about like how bad you have it would the vast majority of the population would not do it because that would be shameful, right? Talking about how much I'm suffering, how traumatized I am, how unlucky I am, how broke I am or whatever. That's something I want to keep to myself because if I say it to other people, they're going to look down on me, they're going to pity me, and that makes me feel shame. The culture has changed so much in the last 100 years that now it's like a victim hierarchy, right? And it's the more that you can get other people feel sorry for you are, the higher social status that you are. So this kind of inversion is completely driven by narcissism to me. It's by a lack of shame. So look at me, look how great I am, or look at me, look how hard I've had it, or how unlucky I am, or whatever. They have the same root from this point of view, and it's both, a lack of shame.
I hope you're enjoying this episode. I just need to take a moment to quickly tell you about a way that you can support the podcast by getting high quality, affordable supplements that Elwin and I personally use, and that's Feel Younger. What I love about Feel Younger is they have great quality products with minimal fillers, but the prices are very affordable. You can call their customer support team 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, and in my experience, they're really helpful and friendly. And what I love most of all is the amazing descriptions Elwin's written for each product category about that topic. There's so much information and education on it. I've actually learned more from reading their product descriptions than I have from most articles. So, to support the podcast, please use Feel Younger for all your supplement needs. And to let them know we sent you, you can use promo code RejuvenateMe for a 20% discount off your first order at feelyounger.net. That's 20% off your first order with promo code RejuvenateMe at feelyounger.net. Okay, so then looking at the list of traits that you said before, if we can identify that somebody is doing those things to a certain level, to a certain degree, then it's more likely that they actually have the narcissistic personality disorder on that level of the spectrum, as you said.
And I would say, you know, like, I'm not a psychiatrist, nor are you. I think even psychotherapists are not allowed to give this diagnosis. It's purely psychiatrists. So the vast majority of narcissistic personality disorder people will never go in front of a psychiatrist, because the only time they ever will is probably if it's court ordered, right? Otherwise, why would they? And so it's not really relevant if a person deserves that diagnosis. They'll probably never get it. What's relevant is how they behave towards you and other people. And if it is, you know, not that much of narcissistic traits, then they can just be addressed as they come up. But if it is a majority and an unwillingness to behave in a way that is not in a non-narcissistic way, even if you put up strong boundaries and state clearly what it is that you expect and what you find reasonable and all the rest of it, if they are belligerent to that and continue to behave in this highly narcissistic way, then it doesn't really matter if they deserve a diagnosis or not. They are ruining your quality of life. And but yeah, that the either unwillingness to see that there's anything wrong with them, the unwillingness to try and be any different or be any better, or depending on your power dynamic with them pretending that they are willing or open, because maybe they're your employee or there's someone else who's dependent on you, they're your child or something like that. Children less common, but you know, it happens, say adult child or whatever. If they're dependent on you, then they may indulge you in, oh yeah, I have to change, you know. And, you know, this happens in other contexts, happens in relationships, right? A partner keeps cheating, or they keep being violent, or they keep being abusive. And then, you know, when the person finally says, all right, I'm leaving you, then they'll be like, oh no, I'm going to change. But if they actually change, if they grow and evolve, they're probably not narcissistic. If they revert right, not truly narcissistic, not narcissistic personality disorder, but if any change they make is kind of only because it's expedient, well, yes, because they can get what they want out of you and temporary, then it's likely that you're dealing with a, you know, truly narcissistic person.
Are there different types of narcissism?
Yes, and I've seen different people, you know, talk about different types. I'll talk about the ones that Dr. Ramani uses, that I've also seen in other places. So first of all, there's the grandiose narcissist, or what I call the direct narcissist. So there's no kind of camouflage of the narcissism. They just, you know, they'll be, hey, look at me, and, you know, tell me I'm great, right? Like, they're very direct and at least honest in, you know, the way that they behave.
Yeah, that's okay. Okay.
So that's the grandiose narcissist. So they're all the horrible things that I said earlier in the traits, but they're not hiding it behind something else.
Right, right.
Then there's the covert narcissist, who is the opposite. So a covert narcissist, so a grandiose narcissist will tend to be loud and always be talking and be self-promoting, all that kind of stuff. The covert narcissist will be the opposite. They will be quiet. They will often be sullen, you know, or withdrawn, rather than trying to get your attention by overt displays. And they will be like, it'll still be look at me, but it'll be look at me, oh, you know, how bad I have it, how much I'm suffering, how hard my life is, how much of a victim I am. And so this is just a different strategy for getting attention and resources from you. Whereas the grandiose person will do it directly, the covert person will do it indirectly, and they'll often use tools of making you feel guilty, making you feel sympathy for them, making you pity them, and getting their resources from you that way instead. They're not as obvious, but they kind of are if you know the game, but they're not as obvious as a grandiose narcissist. Then there's the malignant narcissist. So malignant narcissists are everything that I just said, plus add in a high amount of paranoia and hostility, and then turn up the intensity dial significantly as well. And so I've heard some theories that say like a malignant narcissist is kind of halfway along the way to being a psychopath, so halfway between a narcissist and a psychopath. So the paranoia means that on top of everything else, they distrust you. They will constantly be testing you. They will be constantly be trying to push you away or make you prove your loyalty to them. They're even more focused on you being compliant than the normal narcissist. They will tend to have rage outbursts even more frequently and intently than a normal narcissist. Whereas a normal narcissist will tend to do it. The grandiose narcissist will tend to do it. Even the covert ones will do it sometimes if, you're not paying them enough attention. But the malignant one will do it, in a really nasty way. They can really devastate a person.
Right.
Because of everything I said, though, the intensity of them, they are the most charismatic. Probably more than... I think they're actually the most charismatic of all the types. They're the most charismatic. They're the most intense. They can be the most fun. I know some comedians are malignant narcissists. Like because they are not just seeking attention, they have a contempt for the rules. They have contempt for other people and authority. And so they can be, rebellious and, like extra fun, basically, extra exciting, extra controversial, extra... interesting because they are not just, over the top, but actively hostile to anyone else who they consider to be a competition or a threat. Then there's the communal narcissist. So I've only really heard this one a lot from Dr. Ramani, but I think it's a good one. So this is one that is very focused on helping the world, but actually not very good with the people in their personal lives. So they may, and to be honest, I think Karl Marx is an example of this. He was, let's say, genuinely focused on really wanting to help the poor masses, but he himself had a slave who he impregnated and then eventually got rid of. So this is kind of classic behavior of people who maybe on a conscious level are genuinely focused on making the world a better place and they really want to help. They really want to save humanity, whatever. Maybe Steve Jobs is another example of this, who had a daughter who he refused to admit was his and apparently was very unpleasant in, a lot of personal interactions. But he, profoundly cared about wanting to make the world a better place.
Which seems so odd because it's like, doesn't it making the world a better place start at home? I mean, I don't know. It just kind of seems like you're at a cross purpose.
If you're focused on depth, yes. But if you're focused on superficial appearance, then no.
Back to that point.
Yes, right. Exactly. What matters is, the appearance of saving all the starving children in Africa or the appearance of saving all the, whatever wildlife is endangered in a specific location or whatever. Like that makes me important. That makes me special. That makes me, worthy of, attention and validation and praise and all the rest of it. So I think it's just they enjoy a different flavor of attention. So, the classic narcissist, the grandiose narcissist wants praise and applause. The malignant narcissist really just does want confrontation. The covert narcissist wants pity. The communal narcissist wants, I think, people to see them as good. So not so much praise like sense. Good job, but like almost worship or wow, you're amazing. Wow, maybe idealized. They really want other people to think, wow, this is an amazing, ideal person. That's what they're focused on.
Yeah. Okay. So, grandiose, covert, malignant, and communal. So those are... And
I'll give you one more.
One more? All right. Bring it on.
And this again comes from Dr. Ramani. And I think in a way this might be the most common type, and it's what she calls the low-grade narcissist. So this person is like immature and they're childlike. They can often be like helpless, but they're not malicious. So they're more the feeling entitled, like having other people do things for them. But it's more coming from a place of like being like a child and not having that maturity to embrace personal responsibility. And so, they're not as obnoxious about it as the grandiose people, and they're not as, whiny about it as the covert people. Often there's a boyish or girlish kind of charm to them, and they rarely have the rage outbursts, if ever, and they are, definitely capable of some empathy, and some kindness and all the rest of it, but they're just self-centered and entitled more than anything. And so that's low grade. So it's like, she gives it its own category, and I think it's worth it for the distinction, because it's not just less of everything. It's specifically, still high levels of like entitlement, but not necessarily the predatory attitude, not necessarily the intense, arrogance and stuff like that.
I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, but I see these different traits in individuals, as I was saying before in the other question. And so then I go to like, oh, wait a minute, but does that make him or her a narcissist? Because I see that a few times, like how do you?
Well, they may be in that moment. As I said,
Right.
The point of if they are narcissistic personality disorder is simply, are they correctable?
Right.
Will they stop?
That's the distinction. Right.
Yeah.
Got it.
Because we'll talk about this soon, but there are reasons why you'll have narcissists in your life in the first place. And if you do all the things that you should do with narcissists,
Which I can't wait to find out what that is.
then, if you do all the things that you should do with people in general, and they respond very poorly, then they're more likely to be a narcissist. And then there's a certain way of dealing with them once you realize that they are definitely a narcissist who is not going to snap out of it. There'll be a lot more people though who just have narcissistic traits, but when you make it very clear to them what you do and don't find acceptable and reasonable, they will be willing to snap out of it most of the time, at least. And that's certainly been my experience. The amount of people who are utterly unrepentant is way too much of the population, but it's still certainly not the majority. It's probably a small minority.
Okay. Yeah. So then, how does someone become a narcissist? I mean, like there's, it's like, you've got the types of parenting, is it inherited? Are there genetic factors? I mean, what is it? Nature, nurture, all that kind of stuff.
So this is a good question. I think from what I've seen, most psychiatrists and psychologists are not like very focused on this. I have not seen anyone who explains it satisfactorily to me. I think there are factors though. So genetics is one. I believe that it is pass onable even in the case of, adoption near birth. So where the parent hasn't had the nurture influence, it's still more likely to come about. But I think the nurture influence is big. So if you have, especially if both parents are narcissistic, you're not necessarily going to become narcissistic, although you often have a personality disorder of some kind, because it is extremely difficult. But certainly, even having one parent who's narcissistic or having one parent who's high on the spectrum, even if they're not full blown, basically because we imitate what we're around when we're children, especially our parents, right? So if someone acts narcissistic a lot, we'll act narcissistic a lot. But whether we have that deep wound that makes us not be able to stop, I don't think that's necessarily the case. And so, I do think it is a deep wound. I think that often it is a combination, this is my opinion, of trauma, but more neglect. So it's that needing attention thing that is a function of being ignored. I think that's one of the reasons why narcissism is becoming a pandemic and epidemic. I think because people are busier and have more distraction and input than ever before, because women are working more than ever before, the amount of attention that a child gets from parents is lower than it has been. Now, I realize that in the past, we might have had parents who worked very long hours, 12, 16-hour days on a farm or something like that. But often the child would be involved from a very young age. And I realize, a lot of the time in the past, maybe parents had lots and lots of siblings. So again, you wouldn't get a huge amount of attention necessarily from the parent. So I hear those counter arguments, but I would still maintain that the fact that we have so much distraction these days, see people on their phone all the time, they're just not looking like at their parents, and they're just not paying attention to them. Now, the other side of that is that some parents are the opposite, and they pay, because often people have way fewer children these days, they pay an obsessive amount of attention to their children. And often it actually goes in back and forth bursts. So bursts of being completely neglectful, bursts of paying excessive attention. I think what that can do to a child is make them very insecure, the periods where they're being neglected, but then also very feeling of superiority when they're treated as if they're the center of the universe by the parent. I would suspect that what is ideal is if you spend a lot of time with your parent and you know that they love you and they're around for you and all the rest of it, but they don't treat you as if you're special in the center of the universe, and they get you involved in the things that they themselves are doing from an early age. I think it's just because we're not living hunter-gatherer or agrarian lives for the first time, very recently, we're sitting in front of the desk. Like, if I had a child, I couldn't get them to do my work with me, the vast majority of it, right? And same for a lot of people, for various reasons. When I used to be a chef, I couldn't get them to do work with me because it's a health and safety issue, But in the past, usually we'd have our children around us, or at least the mother would, and ideally both parents would have their children around them, and there would be an extended family, so they'd be around other adults that they know and trust. I think it's a combination of not just neglect, not just the excessive attention, but like the combination of the two is, especially. There is also this thing called attachment theory. And that kind of relates to the attention issue. And so narcissism is definitely a case of insecure attachment. And so I don't want to go into detail about this because there's a whole other thing. But in a nutshell, it's where the child doesn't feel safe to explore the world and be themselves. They will tend to either cling to the mother or they will tend to shut down. Whereas a child who is securely attached will happily run off and play and then happily check in with the mother and back and forth. An insecure attachment will tend to either shut down and ignore the mother, or they'll be obsessively attached to the mother. So that insecure attachment, I believe, and I've heard other psychotherapists say, is a causative factor as well. But that's my understanding, and that's not complete. And I don't believe that there is a complete understanding about what creates it. It's almost like saying, because as we said, we could say it's an early expression or the seed of badness or evil. So it's like, what creates evil in the world? We could almost ask that. Yeah. And so, if you are a parent who is not narcissistic and neither was your partner, and you honestly did your best and your child still ended up narcissistic, it may not be your fault, right? That is possible. It can be, influences from the culture. It can be something else that you as a parent just can't control.
Can somebody be cured from being a narcissist?
It's a good question. The general consensus on that is no. Dr. Ramani is certainly of the position of no. I would say it is very important for you as a person, you, Krissy, me, and everyone, to act as if it is not possible.
Okay.
Because let's say it's a tremendous undertaking. It would have to be hours and hours of therapy a day. It would have to be, constant, monitoring. It would have to be, biochemical monitoring. As we talked about in a previous episode, high levels of serotonin do correlate with both psychopathic and narcissistic behavior. This is an early stage theory, but I believe it may be possible to reduce narcissistic traits, at least, by reducing serotonin, or the desire to express narcissistic traits, the tendency to express narcissistic traits. I think when it comes to how people behave, there may be many, many, many root causes, but I'd say on a moment-to-moment level, there are two key factors, and it's your biochemistry and it's your neurology, your neurological habits. So it's basically what you're used to doing and then what the chemicals in your body are making you feel. And so the combination of those really controls how we behave. And so With a narcissist, it may be possible that by adjusting the biochemistry, reducing the stress chemicals, which they'd hate because they're addicted to them, they're addicted to excitement and drama, increasing the level of oxytocin so they feel good enough as they are, increasing the level of dopamine, so they're less obsessively trying to get validation, decreasing the level of serotonin, so they don't feel as much like the center of the universe. That seems to be what excessive serotonin does. And excessive serotonin eventually leads to hallucinations. And in the early stage, it makes you delusional. And so that tendency to be delusional that narcissistic people have may be quite dependent on serotonin. So we're at very early stages of that. We don't know. But here's the point. You are not going to rewire the neurology and change the biochemistry of your boss, your colleague, your parent, your brother, your sister, your husband, your wife, your girlfriend, boyfriend. That's not going to happen. They're not going to take that from you, even if it is possible. So that's why it's best to act as if it's not possible. Because depending on, again, the power dynamic, if you're dependent on them, they're often far more ruthless and brutal and unpleasant. But if they're dependent on you, they may often, or on some way they're dependent on you, or even if just you're a valuable resource to them that they want to keep around, they will often feed you the bait of hope that they will change to keep you around. This is why a lot of people stay in abusive relationships for a long time. There's usually a cycle of abuse and indifference and abuse and indifference, and then finally the person says, that's enough, I've had enough, or the abusive person even senses that's coming, and they will do it at 180 and they'll start being conciliatory and apologetic and trying to win you over. And part of that strategy of winning you over may well be, I will change. I remember there's a famous song from the South Park movie with Satan and Saddam Hussein. And the joke in that is that Saddam Hussein is like the bad boy, and then Satan is like the victim of the abuse. And Satan's like threatening Saddam Hussein, I'm going to leave you unless you change your ways. And Saddam Hussein does this little song, and the chorus is just, I can change, I can change, I can change. And it's so funny because there's a little cartoon graphic. There's a little dance that all narcissists do. If they value you and they sense that you are trying to remove them, they will do the I can change dance in some form or another. Again, if they feel dominant over you, it will be more bullying and dominant behavior. But if they feel that you have something they want and they can't, if they feel like they can't dominate you and you have something they want, then they will do the I can change routine. And it's it's always false.
Right. No, that makes sense. Yeah. So depending on whether you've established, I guess, certain boundaries or whether you are more of a pushover or not, they will either use one tactic or the other to keep you in their life so that they can continue to get out of you what they want.
100%. Yes.
Right. So then that takes me to, what do narcissists do in relationship? Are certain people targeted more than others? Are there, is that part of it? Are some people more susceptible to the ways of a narcissist?
Yeah. So in terms of who's the target, so there's a whole kind of community around people who consider themselves victims of narcissists. I would say, by the way, that's a dangerous path to go down. That's why I started with the self-pity versus self-importance thing. Mm-hmm. It's very tricky getting out of the clutches of narcissists. And I think we're going to go to that soon. Because, if you talk about, they will try and make you feel as if you're less important than you are. And so, people try and reassert that, oh no, but I am important, which is correct. And yet it's very possible to overdo that and then become more narcissistic. And it's very important. It's very typical for the narcissist to treat you as if your feelings don't matter for many years. And so then when you finally realize that you've been tricked, basically, and that your feelings do matter, and that you have not just been tricked, but you have been hurt, then it's very easy to feel victimized because you have been victimized. But then the more you make that identity and the more you focus on it, the more narcissistic you yourself become. So unfortunately, a narcissist is almost like the Borg, another pop culture reference. Often, like, having any contact with them, like, will turn you into them. So that's something to be very, very wary of. And unfortunately, the process of getting them out of your life, you can very easily become more narcissistic in that process as well. So I'll try and guide on that. But yeah, to answer your other question, let's look at narcissistic relationships. So first of all, they always have drama in the relationships. Narcissistic relationships are rarely boring, or they rarely feel boring. Now, if you truly look at it, they are boring because it's just the same cycle repeating itself over and over without change, which we'll talk about in a sec. But it doesn't feel boring. So narcissist seeks attention. They're not always seeking attention from you, though. So that depends on the phase of the relationship. They may well be doing the opposite. They may well be neglecting you. But if they're not seeking attention from you, they're seeking attention from someone. So they are in a relationship. No matter what position they're in, even if they are in the weaker, more vulnerable position, they will always seek and enforce compliance with their agenda. And obviously, if they're in a position like they're your employee and you're the boss, that's going to be a lot more subtle than if they are your boss, where it's going to be very overt, but nonetheless, it will be there. If they are in a very vulnerable position, then it may just be little tests to see what they can get away with in terms of getting you to do what they want, what suits them. If they're in a more dominant position, this will be very blatant. It will be demands and threats and bribes, maybe all the rest of it. So they... if you feel like they're really listening and paying attention to you in a relationship, it's probably just to get information that they can later use to manipulate you. However, because they are doing it for that reason, they can actually pay attention to you more intensely than most people. Whereas a lot of people, even just normal, slightly narcissistic people, which is what's normal these days, they might not listen very well and often ask you to repeat yourself and stuff like that, because they're kind of checked out and disassociated, not necessarily because they're narcissistic. A narcissistic person, when they are doing their kind of recon on you, when they're trying to win you over or win you back, they will really, really pay attention to you. And to some people that can feel really good, especially people who've been neglected but who didn't become narcissistic, as well as obviously narcissistic people. And so that's one of the things that they can do to win you over. So yeah, the kind of people who are most attracted to them are, often called in that community empaths. But to be honest, yes, they may be more empathic than the average person, but I think but I don't like that because it almost sounds like it means empathic means you're more likely to be a victim. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the key traits that make you more likely to be a victim of a narcissistic person is if you're insecure and if you have weak boundaries. I think those are really the key things. If you're insecure, that means that you're ripe for a narcissist takeover where you become the center of their world. Where they become the center of your world because you feel insecure. And, you'll be more likely to go along with them and agree with them and go, do what they want and all the rest of it.
We're going to take a quick break to share with you one of our amazing sponsors, Genetic Insights. What makes Genetic Insights uniquely valuable is that they test over 83 million different variants, which guarantees a 99.7% accuracy on all of their DNA reports. With over 100 reports available, you get comprehensive insights into what your DNA is telling you about how to optimize your health today and in the future. I found reviewing my results to be incredibly accurate and applying some of the recommendations, which are personalized to your individual DNA, to be extremely helpful for me and my family. I also loved how easy it was to upload my raw DNA data that I already had from previously using Ancestry.com because Genetic Insights supports uploading raw data from all major platforms. To get your health reports, go to geneticinsights.co and get 20% off today by using coupon code Rejuvenate. Remember that supporting our sponsors supports our podcast, which allows us to keep sharing this important information with you free of cost. So, go get your Genetic Insights health reports by going to geneticinsights.co and use coupon code Rejuvenate for 20% off today. Well, I suppose also, so going back to, like especially the communal, if somebody comes across somebody that, or some type of narcissist that is helping that individual, or it's framed in that way, they could almost look at them like a guru or something like that, which really helps save their life. And so then they're in this cyclical space, which I would assume would be very difficult to get out of.
100%. Yeah. I mean, guru is an Indian word, but anyone in that position in any culture is very commonly a narcissist. Yeah. And I'll tell you why. Because being, let's say, a cult leader, let's use an extreme example. Being a cult leader, if you think about it, is a nightmare. You've got to constantly lie to people, manipulate them, trick them. But also, you've got a bunch of slavish people who can't think for themselves, who are constantly dependent on you. It's a massive ball ache to anyone reasonable. Why would you want to do that? And, let alone, you have to constantly get rid of outside threats. And, just what a nightmare. I would hate it. And yet... So you have to be a narcissist for this to be appealing to you. I mean, there's almost something similar with a politician. I do believe that in the olden days, people, and perhaps a tiny bit still, people became politicians out of principle. But again, it's a nightmare. You got half the population hating you, the other half not happy that you haven't done enough of what they want. You're not getting paid that much compared to if you went into business instead with, similar contacts and skills. You got this massive amount of pressure, which often prematurely ages them when they're in the high position. Like, you would only do it because you want power and or that much attention, right? So it's absolutely the same with being a guru, with being a cult leader, with being a religious leader a lot of the time, political leader, spiritual leader. Unfortunately, the people who do it out of... because it's the right thing, is less and less. And here's the other important point. The saying, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Mm-hmm. So here's the thing. You might start as a person who has good intentions and, let's say, mild to medium narcissistic traits. And then if for whatever reason you become very, very popular, very, very powerful, the chance that that doesn't flip into full-blown narcissism is low because of that thing. So if you have a narcissistic traits almost like a plant, and the more power, the more influence, the more of a following, the more attention you have, the more it grows that plant of narcissism, to be a full-blown tree. And so I would say that, when you seek out to help people in any kind of public way, or, even in just helping local people, right? If everyone local to you comes to your place for you to help them and you help people, then suddenly everywhere you go, people are going to look at you like, hey, wow, you're great. And it's so any time that something like that happens, you have to resist the tendency to go down that narcissistic pathway and actively cultivate the qualities that I talked about earlier: humility, modesty, patience, openness to being wrong, compassion, temperance, forgiveness, personal responsibility, and authenticity. And here's the crucial point: the actual possession of those traits and not the presentation of them, because the presentation of them is common, right? Like smart, powerful people learn that success leads to envy. And so they know that they must act humble. Oh, it's just luck that I ended up in this position. Oh, it's all the other people that deserve the credit, not me. But they say that because they know it stops people getting envious and therefore hating them. But they don't really mean it. They don't really feel it. They're saying that to protect themselves. And so what I mean is not acting humble or acting patient or whatever, but actually feeling that way deep down.
Right.
That's the crucial thing to protect you from going down that narcissistic pathway. Because I absolutely do believe that there are many, many people who start off with good intentions and not severe narcissism who end up totally full-blown. And I think this explains a lot of our heroes, whether it's political heroes, spiritual, religious, whatever it might be, who we maybe have known for a long time, and we feel that when they started they were great, and yet now they have really, degenerated, or maybe we found out behind the scenes information from them, even though they haven't publicly degenerated. And I think a lot of the time it is that. I think that power corrupts all but the most dedicated to not being narcissistic.
Good point. Really good point. So, okay. Yeah, that's a lot to take in, a lot to think about, because even though somebody might start out, like you were saying, with really good intentions, but as they move into the machine of it all and other things come in and those influences, that they may not stay on that beginning path. So that's something to watch, especially for somebody that is involved with a narcissist. And like what you were saying earlier, the way to get uninvolved can lead to that very thing that you're trying to get away from as well. Can bring more of those traits out.
Yes. In fact, that reminds me, let's get back to narcissistic relationships. So I'll just go for the rest of this. They can easily press your buttons, right? So unless we are truly enlightened or whatever, we all have areas where we can go into a reactive mode, right? If you just say the right thing or do the right thing that triggers my trauma or triggers my issues or whatever, you can get a reaction out of me, right? And so narcissists are masters of doing that, being able to push your buttons. This is not just the negative buttons, though. This is also the positive buttons, right? They're masters at I like, again, I know this is sounding almost religious, but I said I've kind of got into religion more as a result of studying narcissism. Like I look at a lot of the 7 deadly sins, and I feel like, again, a lot of people in the narcissistic abuse survival community are kind of focused on being victims. But I feel like, yes, narcissists take advantage of your insecurity. Yes, they take advantage of your lack of boundaries. If you have those, you probably have them because you didn't have a great upbringing, and that deserves compassion. But I feel that the way that narcissists really win us over is through pandering to the 7 greatest sins in us. So our own pride, when they do their first step of the 4 steps of a narcissistic relationship, which is referred to as idealization, they do this terminology you've probably heard called love bombing, right? And what is that? Making you feel special, making you feel important, making you feel valued. Now, there's nothing wrong with these things, in theory. And of course, to someone who is insecure with low self-esteem, it feels wonderful to be validated and have attention and all the rest of it. But it's also playing to pride, right? They're making us feel special. They're making us feel important. Well, if you're used to feeling worthless, then obviously that feels great. But actually, feeling worthless and feeling like you're worth more than everyone else are 2 sides of the same coin. They're both aberrations. They're both signs of psychological ill health, and I would say even maybe religious, spiritual ill health. So that's the roller coaster of being with a narcissist. One of them is you go between feeling very valuable, very important when they are love bombing you, to feeling, worthless when they're maybe doing the other stages, like the devaluation and discard stage, which I'll talk about in a sec. So, I think they play to pride. They play to lust if they can, right? If you lust after them, a lot of people have got away with a lot of narcissistic behavior because of sex, on both sides, not just, women using sex with men, but absolutely the other way around as well. And again, because they're exciting and charismatic and all the rest of it, sex with a narcissist can be very, very enjoyable. And also because although they're delusional about themselves, they are quite attentive to you and they want to be. So they may be better at making you feel pleasure than, the average person can. So they definitely can work through lust. They can work through greed. That's very common. The classic thing is the get rich quick scheme. But, another example might be you have a parent who's narcissistic and you keep doing what they want because you want the inheritance. Well, then they're playing to greed, right? Because the definition of greed to me is not wanting a lot. The definition of greed to me is wanting something you haven't earned. Well, the only way that you earn an inheritance is by putting up with, bad behavior by your parent, in effect, right? So they're kind of playing to your greed in that way. Anyway, I won't go through all the 7 deadly sins, but you see what I mean? Like they're often,
that makes sense.
They're actually playing to the little seeds of evil within you. And I think that's one of the values of having interactions with a narcissist, if you survive and escape, is they've helped you to weed out those part of yourselves which went along with their agenda because you have that within you as well. So yeah, let me get, then there's gaslighting. That's part of a narcissistic relationship. Again, common terminology from narcissism. So gaslighting, what is it? It's convincing you of something that's not true with such persistence, such force, such charisma, such certainty that you start to question what is real. And so, you may know exactly what happened, but they'll convince you it was something else. And of course, the usual thing will be that it's not their fault. That would be a classic subject to the gaslighting. Maybe it's that it is your fault. That might be another example. Or, just those would be the two most common ones. They have a stunning level of projection. We talked about the hypocrisy already earlier, but they will literally, and they'll do this in personal relationships. They'll also do it, on TV or in front of the world. Accuse you of being what they themselves are, or accuse you of supporting something they themselves support, or whatever. Right? It's just like the level of projection is amazing, and again, it's dependent on shamelessness, right? And whenever you hear people say, how could they say that when they themselves, right? That's why. Yeah. It's the lack of shame, which is, the hallmark of narcissism to me. Okay, and then there's the 4 phases of narcissistic relationship. So this is really important to understand. So this is another one to answer your earlier question of how do I know if I'm with a narcissist? If you recognize these stages of relationship and you feel like you are pretty much always in one of them, that's a really classic sign of a classic narcissistic relationship. So the first stage is idealization. This is where they're either trying to win you over in the first place, because most people are quite wary of people, quite defensive, quite, not open to new people. So narcissists know that and they'll win you over. So love bombing is one term for that within a romantic relationship, but actually it's in any level. Let's say someone really wants a job with you and they keep sending you, gifts and CVs and, showing up at your office and stuff. That could be like the career version of love bombing, right? There's whatever version. So now, and as I said, they'll be paying a lot of attention to you at the time, gathering data, which they can use later. Now, the next step is to devalue you. So this is all kinds of behavior of putting you down, either overtly or subtly, depending on, various factors. But making you feel as if you are unimportant, making you feel as if your feelings don't matter or aren't as important, making you feel as if you're less important than them, of course, would be the crucial part of it. Making you feel as if your judgment is not as good as them and then your decision making is not as good as them is key features. Why? Because once you accept that, then you'll be compliant with them, right? Because if I am not able to make decisions as well as you, then I better listen to you. And I'm going to do what you want because that's all you have to say because you're a narcissist. So yeah, those are some of the key elements of devaluation. Now, eventually, despite what I said a little bit earlier about cult leaders, and this is what I mean about the predatory attitude, eventually, this is less true of the covert narcissist, but I think it's true of all the other types. Eventually, they will get bored of you. Once they have really ground you down to be their, willing and, applauding slave, they will lose all respect for you and interest in you. You'll then kind of be a resource that they feel like they've drained, maybe like a vampire has drained blood and you're empty, and they will start to ignore you. And that's called the discard stage. Now, this has 2 purposes. First of all, it means they can go out and get fresh attention. And I notice I'm kind of using this terminology for attention as if it's a resource, kind of like a vampire would talk about blood. Right. I'm doing that on purpose because you have to understand that's exactly how they think. That's why I'm trying to communicate that way. So at this stage, first of all, they get to have some fresh, tasty resource from someone else. But second of all, by neglecting you, pushing you away, it makes you start to feel insecure and reach out to them in most cases because they bonded with you with the first stage, the idealization. As a result of the second stage, you feel like you're not good enough on your own. So of course, when they do the third stage of neglect, you're going to reach out to them like, I need you, I want you. And so that will then be perfect for them when, and this can vary from a few hours to a few years, but at some point they'll decide, maybe, this person is a useful resource again. And then they'll come back to you. And then as much as you might feel hurt about what they did, you also feel that longing feeling still. That will be there in the back of your mind, and maybe they're at the front of your mind. It may be the primary thing. You may be willing to forgive all the abusive behavior that happened during the devaluation stage and all the neglect that happened during the discard phase, because you feel such a longing, and you feel such a there's a hole in my heart without you, that kind of thing. You feel like you really need them.
The idealization, the devalue, discard. But what was the title of the fourth?
So yeah, the fourth stage is the last stage, and they call that the hoover stage, and that is getting you back again. So that's now the winning you back can be very easy if the making you long for them has been successful. It may be more difficult. If you're more of a aggressive, type, then you may be more like unforgiving of their behavior. But whatever it is, it's their attempts to get you back again. And then if it's very easy to get you back, they'll go very quickly to devaluation. If it's not easy, maybe they'll spend a long time with idealization. And again, I'm kind of talking about big phases now, maybe within months or years, but this actually happens even within a conversation with them, So they might start off to praise you to get their attention, then they'll put you down, then they'll get distracted and lose interest in you, and then they go back to saying something nice to you again. And in the meantime, you're on a roller coaster. Oh, I feel great when they say something nice about me. Oh, I'm starting to feel bad about myself while they're putting me down. Oh, now I'm really longing them and wishing for them to pay attention to me again. Oh, they're back again. Great. So, and that stage produces a very, very powerful bonding that's often called like a Stockholm syndrome.
Sounds exhausting.
It is. It is. And so this leads back to my first point, right? It's arguably worse for you than smoking cigarettes or eating junk food or anything to have a relationship with someone like this who is a regular part of your life. Either you're spending many hours with them, intermittently at least, or you're spending at least, a little bit of time with them daily. Even just, a 2-minute conversation or a 5-minute conversation with a narcissist once a day can ruin your whole day, and therefore ruin your whole life if they have enough, history with you and enough ability to push your buttons and all the rest of it. And certainly spending many, many hours, if you spend a day with them a month or something like that, that can, cause so much stress in you that it takes some months to recover. That's the kind of level that I'm talking about. Now, some people handle it better than others, and obviously, if you spend most of every day with someone like that, how can you be healthy? I mean, it's possible, but only if you have very strong genetics. And even then, if you have very strong genetics, like often suppressing these feelings that you feel that you've been told are not valid by the narcissist and that you believed, causes health issues. Often pain or allergies or digestive issues are all issues that frequently come up as a result of suppressed emotions.
Yeah, the things that aren't easy to diagnose because they're like, well, we don't, it's not there. It's like really the root cause is more in that emotional.
Totally.
Yeah.
Or chronic infections in general as well.
Right.
Yeah, they're another sign of it.
Elwin, this has been fantastic. I know we're coming up for time, so we're going to have to stop here. And we will continue this conversation into a part 2. So please, everyone, do look out for Narcissism and Relationships Part 2. That'll be coming out very, very soon. Please remember to hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss an episode, and we'll see you for part 2.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that video. You may have noticed I recommended a few different videos in that episode, and one of the ones I recommend is just here, if you want to click there, or another one I recommend is just below, if you want to click on that one and watch that next.